There are many videos about the winged hussars to be found online. I personally watched many of them, and in all honesty, most of them treat the topic very superficially, and some important things are never mentioned at all. So I decided to make a video which talks about the winged hussars in more detail. Did the winged hussars really wear wings? Why did their enemies believe they had immortal horses? And was their armor really bulletproof? Prepare to learn things about this absurdly overpowered cavalry force, which you most likely never heard before. So sit back, relax, and let's have a cup of absurdity. A quick recap of the history. The winged hussars started as a military formation in 16th century Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that is Central Eastern Europe. At the beginning, they were a formation of light-armed and armored cavalry, using lances, chainmail armor, a shield, and a sword as a sidearm. They were used for quick, swift attacks and maneuvering on enemy flanks. The unit, alongside the rest of the kingdom's army, was reformed by István Báthory, a Hungarian noble elected to be the king of Poland. With this reform and over time, the formation changed into elite shock cavalry, which dominated the battlefields of Central and Eastern Europe in the 17th century. I mean, there is a reason for Polish cavalry to have 2 spots on the famous shock chargers list on the wiki page. I won't talk about their history, how they changed over time, as well as their battles in this video. Though if this one does well, I will make another one about those facts. But in this video, I want to tell you about the hussars during their peak. About the times when the hussars were so feared and powerful, they could defeat a foe 3 times stronger. This specific example happened in 1605. In the Battle of Kirchholm, the Polish forces had only 4,000 men, including 1,000 hussars, but they defeated the Swedish army 12,000 strong, killing at least 8,000 of them, and losing only about 100 soldiers in the process. That's an insane 80 to 1 KD ratio, and a proof that they were real pros. So what made the winged hussars so effective? Well, this is a simple question with a complicated answer. First, the winged hussars were the elite. Think politicians, leaders, business and landowners, people with massive wealth and resources going to fight on the front lines themselves, or sending their sons to do so. Unthinkable now, but it was what made the winged hussars special. It ensured they had the best horses, the best equipment and the best training. That's because they had to provide all of their equipment themselves. Indeed, like a Roman legionary, they had to purchase their horse, their armor and their weapons all by themselves. Well, that's not entirely true, at least when it comes to the weapons, because their lances were the only thing they were provided by the state, and it was the duty of their commander to ensure every hussar had a few lances ready at all times. So why would anyone join the hussars if it required an investment worth half a dozen villages? And the reasons were simple, and very similar to our modern ones: glory, money, and power. The best hussars could expect to rise in the ranks very quickly and earn themselves a position or an office in the kingdom administration. Serving as a winged hussar was also linked to prestige, probably the most you could get in the Polish-Lithuanian army without being the hetman or the high commander. Although many of those commanders did start in the winged hussars, so as I said, a good career choice. Their deeds would give them publicity, and the spoils of war usually granted very swift returns on the investment. Provided of course that the hussar didn't die. That's why they were prepared thoroughly for their role. They were highly trained in warfare, and their education involved knowledge of tactics, logistics, and even human psychology. In fact, winged hussars were one of the first formations to systematically take advantage of the psychological aspect of warfare. Everything about them, their attire, formation, weapons, and even the sound their charge made was designed to be both effective and terrifying to the enemy. Imagine you're an Ottoman janissary. You've trained against the cavalry, you know what horses, lances and firearms are, but then you see a wall of riders, shining steel and wild force, winged like angels of retribution. Lances long enough to impel half a dozen people a strike, their charge accompanied not only by the thundering of horse hooves, but also making a deafening, fluttering noise as they are riding directly at you, so fast that you only have time to shoot your musket once. You're shaking hands, wasting the lead. Yeah, the Hussars were very adept at inciting panic in enemy ranks. So let's talk about everything that made it possible. But first, a quick self-insert here to remind you to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my content. Thanks! First, let's address the elephant in the room, the wings. To this day, historians discuss their authenticity. I mean, we know for sure that the wings were definitely a thing, but there are questions. For example, were the Hussars wearing them in combat? Were the wings always in pairs? Were they strapped to the saddle or to the armor? The simple answer is yes. The more complicated answer is every Hussar did as he pleased. The winged Hussars were not really an uniform force that you might see in the later paintings or in the few movies they were shown in. This will be a very prominent theme throughout my presentation of Hussar equipment. One of the formatory letters sent to a commander of a newly found unit stated that Hussars could, quote, "for the foe's fright, feathered wings at their discretion equip," end quote. Remember, they were mostly very rich people or children of very rich people, and they wanted to show off their personality just as we do today, and they had the means to do it. The wings were a popular option to show off. So yes, the winged Hussars for sure wore wings, both in battle and for special occasions. Not everyone, not every time, but they did. So, as we have established, the wings were absolutely real and they were used in battle as well. Even if some scholars have doubts about it, the foremost researchers and experts of the topic have long presented evidence in the form of contemporary writings and iconography, which clearly show that Hussars did indeed wear wings to battle, and we know for sure that they had their wings at the famous Battle of Vienna. The forms they took, however, are very different from the majestic angel-like curved wings we can see in paintings. This form of wings came later, in the late 18th century, and due to their shape, which would realistically limit movement in combat, they were only used ceremonially, like at parades or funerals. Some Hussars wore zoomorphic wings, that is, stylized after the real-life bird wings on their armor or shields. Some attached wings to their shoulders or ankles, like Greek Hermes or Roman Mercury. The way of attaching those wings changed over time. At first, only small wings were loosely attached to helmets, shields or pieces of armor. Later, one or two wings attached to the back of the saddle after the hussar was already on the horse became the norm. Very often, it was a simple wooden plank, stuffed with feathers and attached to the back of the saddle. The wings attached to armor became the most popular feat later and was the one most commonly used, for example, at the Charge of Vienna. The styles of the worn wings changed over time, just like the way of attaching them, and they were often different depending on the occasion. Most notably, the parade wings were different from combat ones. The general rule of thumb was that the combat wings should not prevent the warrior from fighting effectively. Another thing is that some historians claim that the hussar wings made a sound while riding that scared the enemy cavalry. That was actually proven to be false. I mean, think about it. How could the sound of feathers get over the sound of equine hooves hitting the ground and the sounds of the battle? No way. They were quiet. But it doesn't mean there was no additional scary sound accompanying the hussar charge. There was, and I'll tell you what it was a bit later. The wings had a different psychological effect, however, and that was visually confusing the enemy, obscuring the real number of soldiers and making the hussars look like wraiths, which was sometimes noted in contemporary sources, as their enemies would often compare them to some supernatural beings. The hussars wore not only wings, but the feathers themselves in large quantities. They used feathers from the very beginning of their formation, and this custom stayed until the hussars were disbanded. They decorated their helmets, armor, weapons and horses with a multitude of colorful feathered crests and plumes, creating a strange, terrifying, yet admittedly very cool image of a weird, pagan-like being. We have sources talking about the number of feathers that were brought on a campaign by a single hussar, and it's a staggering amount. Over 120 full wings of eagles, swans and kestrels, entire bunches of peacock and rooster ones, plus a multitude of dyed feathers, which they very likely stuck into every possible crevice of their armor. I guess the shedding during the battle could be very intense. But you may ask, why wings? First, believe it or not, the winged hussars of Poland weren't the only winged cavalry in the world. Heck, they weren't the only winged cavalry in Europe. They weren't even the only winged cavalry in Poland. The wings were a powerful symbol, widely used in Middle and Eastern Europe. Hungarians, Russians and Ottomans also had their versions of the winged hussars, or another cavalry that wore symbolic wings, though they were never as effective or as popular. The Ottomans most noticeably had a formation very similar to the winged hussars called delis, or deliunaks, which means wild, crazy or daring. Although prominent, they weren't nearly as good as the winged hussars, as when they fought, it did not end well for the Turks. During one battle at Prut River in 1574, 150 hussars completely destroyed a force of 1,000 delis, killing 400 of them and taking their banner. Hungarian lancers also used the symbolic wings, but in their case, they sometimes attached them to their lances. Polish Tatars, which were the steppe people from the east and usually Muslim, had great presence in the Kingdom of Poland as well as in its army, where they formed units of mounted archers, and they also wore prominent wings at their backs. In their case, the wings were often sturdier, doubling as the only defense of the back from slashing attacks. Polish ambassadors and representatives also used wings when attending parades and celebratory marches. We have, for example, French and Italian sources describing the unusual look of those envoys. So I guess the answer to the question, why wings, would be because they look cool, scare enemies, are symbolic, and also, why the heck not? Having the topic of the wings explained, let's move to the armor of the winged hussars. Just like everything in this formation, it varied depending on the user, but at their peak they would wear a plate cuirass, pauldrons, bracers and a very unique helmet called szyszak. Sometimes they would also wear leg protection, usually only covering the thighs. The helmet started as a simple scale or plate cap, but quickly evolved into the intricate design we can admire in the museums now. Some examples are, however, vastly different as they were covered in steel scales, which was more of a fashion statement. So the proper hussar helmet usually consisted of a solid plate bell with a crest, which was influenced by the Western morion helmets. It also had side plates mounted on hinges which protected the sides of the head, sometimes with small holes to allow for better hearing. A special neck guard made from folds which protected the nape of the neck, and a protective bill over the eyes with a hole for mounting a face guard in its desired position. Those face guards were thin but offered excellent protection, not only from melee attacks, but surprisingly also from bullets. In one source we read about a hussar who was shot right in the face guard, but suffered almost no damage besides a broken nose. When not in use, those face guards would be propped up and could be unscrewed and screwed back on in its proper position when the need arised. The hussar helmets were the peak of compromise between keeping the head protected while being as unobstructive to the senses as possible. And they were also quite comfy given they were heavily padded inside with silk and velvet. The largest piece of hussar armor, the cuirass, could also differ quite a lot from hussar to hussar, from scale shirts to plate cuirass with metal bands, as through most of the history their form and quality depended on the wealth or lack of the user. Though usually it consisted of both front and back pieces, there were some hussars who wore only the front piece. Some of the armors included bands on the abdomen which allowed for better flexibility, with some known armors consisting exclusively of those bands. The richest of hussars, the companions, were literal works of art, light yet sturdy, shining radiantly and beautifully decorated with gold and brass. Fun fact, their armor was always shiny because they were experts at polishing. The lower ranked and a bit less well-to-do retainers had to make do with heavier and more rough armor. Usually thicker and made from worse steel, it still provided great protection but weighed significantly more and usually offered less flexibility, though you wouldn't hear them protesting much, as those wearing this type of armor would usually not ride in the first row. Now you may wonder about the distinction between the richer and poorer hussars. Well, it all comes down to the way they were organized. Let's have a quick digression to explain it. The hussar unit, called a banner, was a group made of two classes of hussars, the companions and the retainers. Of them, the companion was the quote-unquote proper hussar. The retainers, of which each companion had at least two, were less well armored and rode worse horses. But it doesn't mean they were some lousy peasants. No, they fought with their companions in the second, third, and fourth row of the formation, where they were less vulnerable to enemy fire. Once the charge broke the enemy positions, they were no less effective in close combat than their richer masters. And in this way of organizing things lied another secret of the Hussars' success. They had the best wingmen. Literally. Another thing I should add is that the Hussars didn't have to be nobility. There were plenty of companions and retainers who came from rich burgher families, and even from richer peasants. Some of the retainers earned enough on the battlefield to then become companions. Overall, it was a very good career choice, and most people, when offered by their lord to become a part of their Hussar retinue, have happily accepted this chance. Though it has to be said that the companions considered themselves to be a better sort and would refuse to ride with a retainer in the first row. The good news is that any retainer could with time become a companion himself and would be accepted as the true creme de la creme of Polish winged cavalry. Not to mention that this honor often came with becoming a noble for the companions with less than illustrious family tree. Anyway, back to the armor. The cuirasses of the companions often underwent a trial by fire. As the name suggests, it involved firing a gun at the armor from a close distance, and only if the armor resisted the bullet without a dent, it was accepted by the hussar. So were the cuirasses bulletproof? Yes and no. You can say that it's a similar situation to our modern bullet-resistant vests. We have different levels of body armor rated for different guns, right? So let's say that their best plates were around level 3 in modern terms. Strangely, the earlier type muskets would penetrate their armor more easily than the later, more modern types. It has to do with the larger caliber of the former. As the musketeers became standardized in Western type armies, the caliber of their weapons would be reduced, also decreasing their penetration potential. So paradoxically, the modernization actually made the guns less lethal to the hussars. Let's say it this way. The hussars' plate chest pieces were not able to stop musket rounds at the beginning of the formation's existence in the 16th century. But in its later years, they indeed were able to resist musket rounds, shot from the gun's effective distance, and almost all of them, excluding scale armor, were resistant to pistol shots. The scale armor was a unique thing in itself, offering less protection than plate. This type of armor, called karacena, was often used by the officers and high-ranking hussars, due to its beautiful and unique appearance. This is an example of the Polish nobility's desire to stand out, even if it compromised their own safety. Remember, the hussar armor could differ quite a bit, since the type of armor was up to the individual companion, especially the cuirass, arm and leg protection. In the beginning they used chainmail armor with plate elements, later including scale armor, and in the later years a plate front cuirass and bracers. Other elements, like shoulder guards, leg plates and bands, were of course widely used, but again, not by every companion and not all the time. They picked their armor and weapons to best counter the enemy, so a different loadout would be used for Cossack insurgents and a completely different one against Swedish pike and musket formation. And against enemy cavalry, yet another setup would be worn. Here you can see some of the examples of hussar armor. Note the differences I mentioned. Another quite notable element of the hussar armor were the skins of wild animals hanging on their shoulders and back, often very exotic ones, like tigers and leopards, but also bears and wolves, which were more easily obtainable. Surprisingly, it also served as a good substitute for back armor for companions with only the frontal cuirass. The skins were tough and thick, some weighing over 20 pounds. This provided enough protection against slashing attacks, but of course it wouldn't stop a musket shot or a pike thrust. But the thing is, the hussars didn't really have to worry about it, as once they turned around, the enemy was usually either dead or running away. But besides that, those furs protected the armor from getting too hot, covered the gaps in the armor, and acted as another element of the hussars' scare tactic. The retainers and less wealthy companions sometimes used colorful fabric to achieve similar effects. The other parts of the hussar armor were not officially required, but were used often enough, especially by the companions. For example, the leg armor became popular thanks to the influence of the Western cavalry formations. They were usually attached to the last fold of the cuirass and were often made of folds themselves. They protected the legs to about half of the shin. Due to the hussars usually wearing high and heavy leather boots, this length was quite enough. Another element were the bracers, which protected the forearms up to the place where the chain shirt sleeve ended. Often beautifully inlaid with brass and gold, these arm guards were made in an oriental style. And finally, these spolders, which were quite similar to medieval ones in that they included armpit shielding plates and several segments covering the arm. Sometimes, especially on the scale-type armor, the pauldrons would have funny faces engraved on them as a humoristic accent. These weren't supposed to cause fear in the enemy, they were more of a manifestation of the sense of humor of the Polish nobility. Some of the hussars also wore gorgets, while others relied on mail covering their neck. I also want to give an honorable mention to the shields. They were used by the hussars for about the first 100 years of the formation's existence, but as their armor got better, they became obsolete. The ones used by the hussars were the round, eastern-type shields, light and relatively small. Often the hussars would attach bird wings to them, as one does, of course. And a little fun fact for you guys as we close the page on hussar armor, let us go back to the topic of the bullet resistance. Did you know that they utilized the earliest known soft body armor that was actually able to stop bullets? Yes, the richest of the hussars wore something known as the torn silk jacket. It was made by densely packing the silk threads between two outer layers of silk. It's a lesser known fact due to the obscurity of the sources, especially for the Western researchers, but there are indeed believable sources talking about them. There is, for example, a letter from the Polish king himself, which states that such garments existed and were able to stop bullets from the contemporary firearms. Quite fitting if you look at the fact that the modern soft armor was invented by a Polish guy. And it used a very similar concept and the same materials. So that's how the winged hussars were armored during their peak. Let's now tackle the equally important topic of their weapons, which were no less iconic than their wings. The main weapon of the hussars, and the only part of their equipment provided for free by the state, were the lances. Contrary to the popular belief, hussars, just like soldiers today, were equipping themselves to match the enemy they were fighting. For example, if they went against the Cossacks, they used shorter lances, up to 3.5 meters long, and reduced the weight of the equipment to maximize speed. This was done because Cossacks didn't use long pikes and did not wear much armor. Against pike and shot formation, well, this was a different story. Since pikes were long, the hussar lance had to be longer. These long lances were up to 6.2 meters long. Yeah, those were some massive shafts indeed. The thing is that to make it effective, they had to be hollowed out inside. These circular holes surprisingly didn't impact the lance's durability too much, but even if it did, it wouldn't have mattered, because after the charge, the lances were discarded immediately, usually after impaling about 3 people on average. The record number of foes impaled on a single lance strike were 6, which was seen a few times. 4 or 5 were more common. That was the downside of standing in rows, one behind another, while nearly a ton of flesh and steel moved towards you at about 40 miles per hour with a sharp stick pointed at you. You could end as a part of a shashlik even when standing in the 3rd row or further. Despite being hollowed out, the lances were still quite hefty, and to allow the hussars to hold and maneuver them, some additional equipment was necessary. A large leather belt, strapped to either the saddle or the horse itself, was used to achieve optimal control over this huge piece of wood. It was dangling over the right side of the horse and fitted with a circular dock, where the hussar would place the bottom part of the lance. During riding, the lance would be held point up, while resting in the dock, and when the charge would commence, the lances would be lowered while still remaining within the dock. Thanks to that, the lance was being held at 2 points, and the hussar was able to aim quite easily with this extremely long tool, and he didn't need to worry about the impact, breaking his bones or ripping off his arm outright. That belt would often last for a single use, and would have to be replaced quickly before the next charge. Another very important part of the hussar's lance was the banner. It was long, thin, and split in two in the middle, both parts then tapering at the ends. This was what made the terrifying charge even scarier to the enemy. It was not the wings that were flapping, but the banners. Hussars' horses were used to the sound, but their foes were not. The loud sound helped create panic in the enemy ranks, be it cavalry or infantry. The lance was made by cutting a long wooden shaft in half, scooping out the inside, and then it was glued back together. Another unique weapon which was used by nearly all hussars was koncerz, a one-handed, long and thin spike with a saber-like handle. It reached lengths from 60 to 75 inches and its blade had a triangular or square cross-section. It was really similar to an estoc, but it was one-handed. When the hussar discarded his lance, he often reached for the koncerz. It allowed him to easily reach the infantry around him and pierce from above through any armor they could have, or to try and thrust precisely into non-armored parts. The enemy cavalry, usually armed with cavalry sabers, were also easily outmatched by the sheer length of koncerz, which in this case could be braced on a modified saddle pommel, causing enemy riders to basically stab themselves on it as they rode by the hussar. Due to their rectangular or triangular cross-section, they couldn't really be used as a slashing weapon, and their long and thin blade, which resembled a needle, often broke during combat, because of which we don't have many examples left, but some of them can still be found in the museums. It was a very popular weapon, though due to its unwieldiness and inability to cut, in some situations an alternative was needed. That's why some of the hussars opted for a backsword, which they called pałasz, instead of a koncerz when fighting a less armored enemy, like Cossacks or Tatars. It was a shorter, more wieldy weapon, which looks basically like a straight saber, with one or both edges sharpened. Still incredibly effective when it came to poking, but with added cutting ability and maneuverability. The M1913 cavalry saber, more widely known as baton saber, is also a pałasz by definition. Another weapon of the hussars, which was an evolved version of a medieval weapon, was nadziak, an edgy son of the medieval warhammer, sporting a nasty spike on one side and a small hammerhead on the other, all on a rather long wooden shaft. It was designed for piercing or bashing in armor. It performed exceptionally well against chainmail, brigandine, lamellar and gambeson type of armor. There is a weapon which, alongside the wings, is also an iconic part of the winged hussar. A weapon as uniquely revered in Poland as the katana is in Japan. I'm of course talking about the famed hussar saber. The hussar saber had a circular curve and a closed guard reaching the pommel of the handle, or a semi-closed guard. A unique feature of the hussar saber was a ring which acted as a thumb guard, strengthening the grip and facilitating direct cuts. It allowed quick drawing of the weapon, and when passing through the target, it allowed for a quick withdrawal of the saber for the next attack. It also provided excellent protection against slashing attacks directed at the thumb of the user, as a damaged or cut-off thumb makes the hand practically useless while fighting. In the second half of the 18th century, a horizontal arch appeared as an additional protection for the hand. The legend of the hussar saber was that in order for the finished weapon to be accepted, it has to pass the trial of iron. And what was this trial about? Well, the blacksmith had to make a frame with at least 5 iron bars in it. The hussar who commissioned the saber would then take a swing at the iron bars, and if the saber cut through all of the bars without its blade being damaged, only then the saber would be accepted by the hussar to serve him as his side weapon. So is this legend true? Well, no, it's not. Is a result of people confusing the hussar saber with a much later weapon, another Polish saber called Ludwikówka from 1934. This one indeed had to cut through an iron bar 5 mm thick 5 times without any damage to the blade to be accepted. Usually combat sabers were not richly decorated, but hussar sabers were an exception. The same blades, which were used in battle, were also worn as ceremonial sabers, so they were richly decorated with gold or silver, as well as precious stones. The crossguard and the pommel were often decorated with an etched or engraved decoration, and the fingers, caps and rosettes of rivets were decoratively shaped. Regardless of the ornamentation, various kinds of maxims were often placed on the blades, ranging from religious and patriotic to funny like, quote, "guard your face" or "I'll kiss you", end quote. It meant of course the blade, not the hussar. The Hussar sabers were of incredibly high quality and exceptional sharpness, so much so that they could cut through limbs with little to no resistance. I mean, they could afford the quality. While the saber was just a sidearm, it was also the quickest weapon to draw and use in the chaos of battle. After the fighting ended, the cut-off limbs still holding muskets were often found on the ground by the looters, a hands-on statement of the Hussars' handiwork. I'm sorry for the puns, it's just the opportunity was quite handy. Okay, keep your hands to yourself, I'm not going to grip this topic any longer. On the other hand, and no, that's not another pun. On the other hand, the winged hussars also utilized ranged weapons. Two types of them in fact. One was an Eastern-style bow, usually associated with mounted archers. Those were short, composite recurve bows, which were really popular and utilized even in the later years of the formation's existence, giving the hussars some flexibility, even if it was a bit of a stretch. The second type were pistols. Worn in holsters by the saddle, they allowed the hussars to create even more mayhem as their charge ended, and the lances were discarded. Smoke from the gunfire would obscure them, and the lead projectiles were quite effective on short distances, allowing the riders to eliminate targets which would pose an immediate threat to them, or to simply sow further chaos in the ranks of the enemy. However, the hussars trying to shoot their pistols while riding a horse had a slight problem with the wind. The thing is, flintlock pistols have to briefly uncover the pan with gunpowder, which is then ignited by the sparks from the flint. And during this brief moment, this black powder would often get blown out due to the speed, which caused the weapon to fail. That's why they used a more complicated mechanism called a wheel-lock pistol. It was indeed more complicated and took longer to reload, but it was much less likely to fail at the press of the trigger. This mechanism was powered by a wound-up spring and did not uncover the powder as it fired. Of course, those pistols would only fire once before having to be reloaded again, and that's why they carried at least two of them. And hey, having two shots is better than having none, right? Also thanks to the sturdy build of these pistols, they were sometimes held by the barrel after being fired and used as a makeshift blunt weapon. They were large, heavy, and it was faster than switching to another weapon, and of course much faster than reloading. The last piece of the equipment that the winged hussars would utilize in their prime is a short mace called the buzdygan. Even though it looks like a melee weapon, I mention it at the end because it was less of a weapon and more of a symbol of office. Used by the unit commanders to gesture and give orders, this heavily decorated club was rarely used to bash in the skulls of the enemy. Obvious male symbolism aside, these maces were widely used in Eastern Europe as a sign of authority, like a king's scepter. Of course, all the weapons were used according to what type of enemy the hussars were facing. The units, like modern military, would pick their weapons to suit their current assignment. When it comes to the other equipment besides weapons and armor, I will cover one important point, because most of the other equipment would match pretty well with the other soldiers' EDC at the time. That means survival gear, basic cooking equipment, basic tools for fixing and preparing weapons, and so on. Of course, the hussars would have servants with them on the campaign, which would work for them during travels and in the camp, and would sometimes either join the infantry in battle or would be left at the camp to protect it and to guard the hussars' possessions. The one other element I mentioned which made the hussars into the elite formation they were is their horse, or horses, plural, because every hussar took at least two of them for every campaign. It was one of the crucial elements, even if they are often forgotten today. Select noble eastern breeds of horses, perhaps a bit smaller than a typical heavy cavalry steeds, but much faster, trained for years and each worth more than a medium-sized village. Another thing was that these horses were closely bonded with their riders. Sometimes the hussars would not eat themselves to give the grain to the horse. As they said, the horse was the life of the hussar. The horses could only become hussar mounts after undergoing arduous training. The horses were taught, among other things, to gallop in a straight line, stop suddenly, and change the direction of running by 180 degrees, which prepared them for quickly changing direction during battle, in order to prepare another charge. Other training methods included galloping with fully armored and armed soldier on the back, getting used to gunfire and banner sounds, as well as group training where the horses were taught to walk and gallop in line. An unique method of training included charging the horse at a few people representing enemy infantry, who would, at the last moment, break the line and make room for the horse to run through. That way, the mount would charge without fear during battle, expecting the enemy to make room for it. I guess a lot of them were unpleasantly surprised. We know what the training looked like because 17th century manuals have survived to our times. The raising and training of a proper hussar horse could take up to 6 years, which only added to its cost on top of its noble descent. There was a myth amongst the Swedish and Moscow soldiers who would return from battling the hussars, that the hussar horses were immortal. It came from the fact that when shot in the torso, the horse wouldn't stop charging. Of course, contrary to the hushed whispers making rounds in the military camps after dark, there was no pagan magic involved in creation of this legend, only simple biology. The horse would run forward for a few more seconds, as his muscles and brain still had enough oxygen to function. The shock and adrenaline prevented the equine from noticing that something's wrong too. This was enough to hit the enemy and fight for a bit before the horse dropped dead. But at that moment, there weren't many enemies left to observe. Of course, if the horse was hit in the leg or the head, it fell down immediately. Though it was a rare occurrence as the musketeers couldn't reliably hit such small and fast-moving targets. Right, I think we talked about everything I wanted to talk: armor, weapons and the horse. That's what really made a winged hussar. But all those things, as you may expect, weren't cheap. I guess you may wonder how much did all of this cost. Well, the experts made some calculations and came up with a number. If you wanted to become a hussar, you'd have to pay for everything excluding the lance. And for that, you'd have to pull out anywhere between 35 and 50 kilograms of silver from your wallet. For context, a stonemason at the time would have to save his pay for 8,000 workdays just to afford this equipment. So what do you think? Was it more or less money than you expected? Now another question is, how did the hussars use all this excellent and costly equipment in battle? To give you a quick overview, their usual tactic was repeated powerful charges. After each charge, they would ride back to their positions to reload their pistols, take a new lance, after which they would charge again and again until the enemy ranks broke and their retreat began. And then the rest of the cavalry went after the hussars to inflict as many casualties on the enemy as possible. Even their enemies held the formation in extremely high regard. The King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, had said that if he had such a cavalry, he would conquer the Ottoman Empire in a single year. Another Swedish monarch went even further and claimed that with 10,000 Polish winged hussars, he could conquer the world. A fun fact is that the Swedish mercenaries required a clause in their contract allowing them to refuse fighting if meeting Polish forces on open fields. The reason being, as you might expect, total domination of Polish cavalry. So yes, they were a force to be reckoned with, but to be absolutely honest, they weren't the Exodia of Renaissance warfare. I mean, they weren't an auto-win card. They had their problems, for example the lack of flexibility and that they were only good for one thing. But they did that thing best of all. Still, a simple ditch was a barrier preventing the hussar charge from happening. So they were kind of a one-trick pony, or rather one-trick warhorse, since they were so effective. But isn't that the case with most units in pre-modern warfare? You wouldn't expect archers to charge an enemy or heavy cavalry to hold the line, would you? Also, they sucked at hide and seek. Why? Because their enemies always heard them coming. Their battle cry, Jesus Maria, was shouted by the entire charging force at the moment they lowered their lances. So, did this great cavalry ever lose a battle? Well, of course they did. Sometimes not really because of the hussars, who would actually carry out their duty, but other factors have resulted in an overall lost battle. But there were a few times their charge would fail and they would be chased out. The winged hussars were also very susceptible to being flanked, which also happened a few times. I will hopefully cover those cases in a future video. So, why was an excellent formation like the winged hussars eventually disbanded? Due to the high cost of joining and the elite profile of the formation, their numbers never went above 9,000 at any given time, with a typical number of hussars being from 7 to 8,000. But hey, if one of them was worth 100 normal soldiers, then what was the problem? Well, it has to do with the economical and political downfall of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century. Less funding, Changes in warfare and external politics have resulted in less relevance of the Hussars, who were ultimately uniformed into a reformed cavalry force, which ultimately ceased to exist after the partitioning of Poland in 1772. Again, I will describe this process in more detail in the future material. And so we've arrived at the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed your time with me. Let me know in the comments if you learned something new. I'd love to hear from you. As I said before, if this video does well among you, my dear audience, I will make a second part where I will talk about the history, battles, tactics, and political influence and importance of the Winged Hussars in much more detail. Give this video a like and subscribe to my channel to let me know that you'd like that. Also, I'm really just beginning as a creator, so any support from you is greatly appreciated. So thank you again for watching till the end. For now, stay safe and absurd, and see you in the next video.